So my name is Tan. I'm a project coordinator at Seville. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering. And if you're new here, I'll make sure to send the link in the chat to our Kumi Now gatherings on our YouTube channel and our Kumi Now action page. Our topic today will be on nonviolence and strategies of nonviolence. And we are joined today by Frank Panopoulos. Hope I pronounced your last name right.
Right.
The first part of our meeting will be dedicated to our guests, but please stay around after he leaves, as we will be dedicating the rest of the hour to turning our knowledge into action as we engage in advocacy for Palestine. And I think this topic today will be very timely as well in terms of actions we can do. So maybe Frank can also help guide us in terms of how to think about nonviolent action. So I want to introduce Frank before we start. Frank Panopoulos has worked with religious and secular groups on peace and social justice issues since 1979. Frank has spent time in prison for acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, including 2 plowshare actions in the 1980s. He also is a human rights attorney, and his current work includes representing prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay Prison, anti-drone war litigation, advising social justice nonprofit organizations on anti-terrorism laws, and defending protesters arrested in DC. So we have quite a veteran with us in terms of protest and action. And thank you so much, Frank, for taking the time today to present to us. And we're really excited to hear from you. And feel free to share your slide.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. And I see Bill Offenloch is there participating, and he and I work together at the Catholic Peace Fellowship. And he, as much as I, is a veteran. Perhaps he's probably even more of a veteran than I am, and he could also give this talk. So I would welcome any of his contributions as well, and as are others on this, on this Zoom. I'm guessing as well. So I'm just going to give a sort of like an overview of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance, historically and contemporarily, and then we could discuss action plans. So nonviolence has 2 intertwined aspects. There's the individual ethic, right, which is living nonviolently. And learning how to live nonviolently, which is a constant effort, at least for me, every day. And then there's nonviolence as a social force for political change. And engaging in one helps to develop the other. And what I'm going to talk about on this talk is the second aspect of nonviolence, which is the social force for political change. And specifically for Christian nonviolence, right? For Christians, the ethic stems from Jesus's nonviolence as the way of living faithfully to God, for both an individual and, importantly, for a polity, right? So Jesus's nonviolence and his teachings were not just for individual piety; they were also for how we should live as a society. For example, love your enemies is an ethic for you and me, but it's also an ethic for a sovereign state, right? To disarm. So the theory of nonviolent action or nonviolent resistance looks first at the nature of political power, and you can divide the nature of political power into a binary, a monolithic theory and a pluralistic theory. The monolithic theory, looks at power of a government as residing in the few who stand at the pinnacle of command, and they rule by the threat of violence and self-restraint. And then you have a pluralistic model of political power, which looks at the power of the government depends on the cooperation and the assistance of people. In other words, people to run the bureaucracy and to run the institutions, people who give their consent to the people at the pinnacle to rule. And so a nonviolent resistance is based on the pluralistic concept of political power. And its basic premise is that the political power of even an oppressive regime can be destroyed by people withdrawing cooperation and consent to those who govern. So non-cooperation and civil disobedience is a key strategy for nonviolent resistance. And that non-cooperation has to be massive and it has to be sustained. It can't be just for a one time when you're talking about changing a social structure. Um, Nonviolence is a form also of political jujitsu. The violence of the oppressor is exposed to the world and used to undermine support for the regime. So the violence of the oppressor is basically used against them. As Dr. King wrote from his letter from Birmingham City Jail, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to negotiate and confront the issue. Just if you hold on a second, there you go. Oh, sorry, just I want to get more here. Right. So, nonviolence also rejects violence as a form of resistance. Mohandas Gandhi called nonviolent resistance satyagraha, literally holding on to the truth or truth force. Um, Nonviolent resistance excludes the use of violence because one is not capable of knowing the absolute truth and therefore not competent to punish. You can't use, and in another place he explained that you can't use violent means to obtain a peaceful end. Um, uh, to talk about strategies or tactics of nonviolence, I prefer and recommend Gene Sharp's The Politics of Nonviolent Action. It's an action guide for civilian-based defense. In other words, a defense of an occupied people from an occupying power, and a guide for resisting oppressive regimes. It's a 3-volume set. And the second part, the methods of nonviolent action, in that book, he gives 198 methods of nonviolent action from historical examples. For example, marches, parades, picketing, religious processions, mock funerals, strikes, slowdowns, walkouts, lockouts, boycotts, divestment, civil disobedience, sabotage, wearing symbols, street theater, refusing to assist enforcement, international sanctions. Um, uh, just to give a sort of a history of various nonviolent campaigns and actions, I'll just start with in the early 20th century, child labor. So, in order for child labor to be outlawed, you had strikes, you had journalism. Photographers went around and actually they took pictures of child labor, as you can see in this picture of 2 children working in a mill. And there were marches. For example, in 1903, Mother Jones, right, Mary Harris, led a march of children laborers from a Philadelphia factory all the way north to President Roosevelt's home on Long Island. So it was this kind of direct nonviolent action that ultimately led to the passage of laws that prohibited child labor. Um, Women's suffrage, right? The women's suffrage movement struggled for more than 70 years to gain women the right to vote through the passage of a constitutional amendment here in the US. During World War I, women vigiled daily at the White House. They surrounded the White House fence and were there every day, right, to picket and ask for President Wilson's support for them to get the right to vote. And many were arrested at this time, including Dorothy Day, who helped to found the Catholic Worker years later. Mohandas Gandhi's salt march, right? Salt was a staple product of India, right? As part of its economic exploitation of India, England taxed salt produced in India, just like the English taxed tea in the American colonies, which led to the Boston Tea Party. So in 1930, Gandhi organized a protest march to the sea to make salt and defy the English law taxing salt, and he was successful. And in this march, which started with perhaps 100 people, it grew to tens of thousands of people. Uh, Going to the Vietnam War. So the opposition to the Vietnam War here in the U.S. included draft resistance, and that took many forms. It took the form of draft board raids, where groups of people went into draft boards, took out the files, and burned them or destroyed them. It took the form of young men burning their draft cards, and it took the form of marches and notable figures like Muhammad Ali, the boxer, who refused to be drafted. It also took the form of massive protests. The May Day protests in 1971 were a turning point in the anti-war movement. You had 500,000 people march and rally on April 24th, and then you had massive civil disobedience from May 3 to 5 in Washington, D.C., where affinity groups blocked intersections as well as government buildings. 12,000 people were arrested during those 3 days, and they were put in a makeshift prison at the at RFK Stadium in Washington at the football field, and this exposed, the not only the violence but the hypocrisy of the government, of the U.S. government, that was claiming to be fighting for democracy and freedom in Vietnam, and here it was jailing its own people in these makeshift tents that were, reminded people of sort of concentration camps in a way. And then we have the South Africa anti-apartheid campaign, which used all sorts of means to help bring down apartheid, including international boycott, as written in the preparation manual for the emergency convocation of the churches in South Africa, being committed to nonviolent and peaceful ways of ending apartheid. Right? They developed a manual with effective nonviolent actions for people to take in order to bring the government to the negotiation table to get rid of apartheid. You also had here in the U.S. ACT UP, which groups of people, almost entirely gay people, right, would came together to publicize that there was no medicine for people who are contracting AIDS, that people with AIDS were being discriminated against, and that something had to be done, and people with AIDS could not be neglected, as well as raising issues of homophobia. And so, similar to the 1971 May Day protests, ACT UP used a strategy of mass civil disobedience and disruption in order to make people aware of what was happening to people who had contracted AIDS, including eventually having a meeting with Dr. Fauci, who at that time had started as the head of infectious disease at the National Institute of Health, and who eventually came around to understand what was happening with people with AIDS, and increasing the efforts at NIH to develop medicine for people who had contracted AIDS. And then you have anti-nuclear weapons protests historically going back to the 1950s and after. But you had June 12th, 1982, where more than 1 million people marched in New York City to protest nuclear weapons and to advocate disarmament. You had the E and D and the C and D campaigns at the same time in Europe, including the Greenham Common Women's Encampment, which women encamped and encircled a base in England at Greenham Common where intermediate nuclear weapons were to be deployed. You have the Golden Rule sailboat that sails around the world to bring attention to the issue of and the necessity of nuclear disarmament and nuclear war as an existential threat. And you have local civil disobedience and actions, including this one at Electric Boat in New London, Connecticut, at the engineering building, where people made replicas of of Dr. Oppenheimer, life-size replicas, and strung them across the entrance to the engineering building to bring attention to the fact that the building of a new class of nuclear weapon submarines was a threat, to the world and sinful, illegal. And you have plowshares actions, acting in community and individually. People have entered military bases and weapons facilities using hammers to symbolically and actually disarm components of, U.S. first strike nuclear weapons. Since 1980, you've had more than 200 people participate in some 101 plowshares actions. 58 were in the U.S. and 43 were abroad. And these are powerful actions of civil disobedience because people enter into the facilities that make the nuclear weapons, and they pour their own blood and they hammer on the components, bringing attention to the fact that a nuclear war would be an omnicide. It would destroy the earth. That it's idolatry to put your security in nuclear weapons and as a tactic for people to follow. I mean, you can just imagine if thousands and thousands of people would enter onto bases to perform these acts of disarmament. Uh, you have Extinction Rebellion, climate activists who use street theater, die-ins, and defacing art to bring attention to the existential threat that the continued use of fossil fuel poses to us. And you have the campaign to stop killer robots, where because of the automation of weapons on the battlefield now, as we see in the Ukraine and as we see in Gaza and elsewhere, right? There has to be some sort of regulation of these weapons or a complete banning of them. And so states are calling for a new international law to limit these weapons, if not to outright abandon them. And using the law and creating new law in order to stop injustice is also another tactic to use in conjunction with nonviolent civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. And then if you want to look at historical movements against oppressive regimes, we can look at Poland's Solidarity movement, for example. Solidarity used many nonviolent tactics, including flags, vigils, symbolic funerals, parades, Catholic masses, work slowdowns, strikes, literature, commemorations of forbidden anniversaries. All of these tactics were used in solidarity, which helped eventually not only to get rid of, the president of Poland at the time, who was basically a puppet of the Soviet Union, but ultimately helped lead to the downfall of the Eastern Bloc, of the Soviet Union and all of its client states in Eastern Europe. You had the Philippine People Power Revolution, also called the Rosary Revolution or the Yellow Ribbon Revolution, right? In February 1986, the Philippine people spontaneously rose up and overthrew the Marcos regime that had been in power for almost 30 years, and they elected Cory Aquino as president 2 days later. This was essentially a movement where no violence was used, or if any violence was used, it was against the demonstrators, but not by the demonstrators. The Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, right? These were spontaneous, popular, nonviolent uprisings that within a month brought the downfall of a dictatorial regime, of Ben Ali's in Tunisia and Mubarak's in Egypt. And of course, all of these movements in the aftermath have their issues and have their problems. Usually the problem is a backlash by people opposing the new government and wanting to either bring back a dictatorship or at least promote and protect the wealth of the oligarchy that is actually in charge of the country. So, for example, in Egypt, the regime that replaced Mubarak's eventually in several years was brought down by Sisi and the current president because he was backed by the military, and the military's oligarchy on the economy was threatened by the government that replaced Mubarak. Um, and the same in the Philippines, you can say, now we have Marcos's son as president of the Philippines. So, over time, there's always a backlash to the nonviolent revolution, and the issue becomes how can the forces that sustained the nonviolent revolution continue in power without becoming corrupted and maintaining, sort of the solidarity of the people to withstand any onslaught against them. Um, so Gandhi created some rules for nonviolent resistors who he called satyagrahis, right? And they included not harboring any anger, suffer the anger of the opponent, put up with the assaults of the opponent, never retaliate, but do not submit to any order given in anger, voluntarily submit to arrest, and never insult your opponent. Dr. King had similar principles for nonviolence that he wrote about in Stride Toward Freedom. He wrote that one can resist evil without resorting to violence, that nonviolence seeks to win the friendship and understanding of the opponent, not to humiliate them, that evil itself, not the people committing the evil acts, should be opposed. Those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation because suffering can be redemptive. Nonviolent resistance avoids external physical violence and internal violence of the spirit as well, right? He gave the example that the nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his or her opponent, but he or she also refuses to hate them. The nonviolent resistor must have a deep faith in the future, stemming from the conviction that the universe is on the side of justice. Um, and then I just like to say that with respect to nonviolent struggles, Angela Davis wrote a wonderful book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, where she talks about the need for intersectionality of struggles. She wrote that we talk about bringing various social justice struggles together across national borders. And so in her book, she related how Ferguson, the killing of a black youth in Ferguson and the police response to the rising up of the African American population protesting that killing was similar and related to the occupation in Palestine and now the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. And so I think that when we talk about nonviolent resistance and nonviolent strategies, we need to talk about combining struggles because they're all related. They're related basically, in my view, to a white supremacist philosophy that seeks to maintain its wealth, an oligarchy. Or, you can look at it more broadly as all of our struggles are for social justice, and against social injustices, and they're interrelated. But either way, we need to combine struggles. I was at a demonstration a week ago downtown, and there were two demonstrations next to each other. One was in front of the Treasury, protesting Elon Musk's takeover of the Treasury building and the financial database, and the other one around the corner in front of the White House was of Palestinians, basically, and Muslims who were protesting the idea that the U.S. could own and take over Gaza and expel the Palestinians and build a resort with hotels and with casinos. But these two struggles didn't join. They were kept separate, and I thought that this was ridiculous. That it's the same issue, and so both should combine. And when we combine, we're stronger because there's more people. Um, and then to talk about Gaza, so here in the U.S. and in Washington, we've had protests beginning right soon after October 7th and Israel's start of the genocide in Gaza. But as you can see, these individual protests are not enough. They're not massive enough or sustained enough. And in my view, international support is vital to the success in protecting Palestinians from forced removal, which is, now the current threat. Um, I think that if you look at the campaign in South Africa against apartheid, the international support in the form of the boycott and the sanctions helped it, I think, importantly, to overcome apartheid and to help Bishop Tutu and the Council of Churches and the others who were working against the apartheid regime. And so, to me, with respect to Gaza and Palestine, the West Bank, South Africa's case in the ICJ to stop Israel's genocide is critical, and I am hoping that South Africa continues to challenge Israel and the U.S. now in the ICJ. The ICC warrants to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant also for crimes against humanity, I think were important because both of these international campaigns, help bring not only awareness of the issue, but also credibility to the claims of genocide and credibility to the just the basic wrongness of what was happening. Like I said, a global boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is vital to supporting the Palestinians, as it was for South Africa's anti-apartheid campaign. And then, the support of global institutions is important, like the UN, the denominations of all faiths, international unions and associations. Because the alternative to not having this kind of international support is statelessness, like the Rohingya who were expelled, from Myanmar. And now, 1.1 million Rohingya live in the largest refugee camp in the world in Bangladesh. And so it's not enough that we just have domestic protest for what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. It's important as it is and critical as it is, at least in the US, because it's the US government that's backing Israel and sending the bombs and now proposing to develop Gaza into a resort. But international support is vital. And so, in this regard, I don't know what Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia will do with respect to, countering, what's happening now in Palestine, or for that matter, any of the other countries. But, whatever happens, without international support, it'll be that much more difficult to help protect the rights of the Palestinians, if at all. So that's my presentation, and I'm happy to talk about strategies and action plans and answer any questions. So I'm going to stop the share, and then I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Frank. And yeah, we can move a little bit more into actions and what people can do to be involved with this. One question I had, I think some people had questions on or comments in terms of sustained resistance. So is there anything you want to say about sustained nonviolent resistance? I think a lot of people, especially participating in nonviolent protests, they get impatient with how slow the results are. But it's also important that there's an understanding. I think the history that you provided through the presentation was really helpful to understand that there's a history of methods and tactics that are protracted for a long period of time. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this.
Only this, that the Black Lives Matter protests here in the US were an example of sustained and massive protest, right? Spontaneous around the country. And when they got large enough, and when they got large enough and were happening day after day, right? The cities like in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, started to think about having laws to change how the response of the police, right? And and then you had the backlash by the Trump administration, bringing all sorts of law enforcement to try and quell the protests and to discredit them by calling them like communists infiltrated and and anarchists and whatnot, right? And so I think that so even though the Black Lives Matter protests gained some ground in curtailing police abuse, it didn't stop that abuse, and the abuse continues. And you can say that it was only marginal, which I think it was, right? But it shows how much you need in terms of sustained action and how massive and sustained action you need. You would need something much larger in this country anyway than the Black Lives Matter protests in order to affect change. And one way I describe it is like this. Um, there's a meme that protest groups use, which is, shut it down, stop business as usual. Well, the only time in this country that business as usual came to a halt was during the pandemic. The pandemic shut down the US. And so if you want to change, if you want to have a nonviolent change, you need to have a social force at least as powerful as the pandemic in order to bring the society to a halt and to change things. And by change, I don't just mean bringing it to a halt by protest. You also have to have a set of laws that the Congress would pass, because the legal aspects of any social change are work together with the protest in the street, and the filling of the jails, right? It's just that here, lots of times people think they can just go right away to the Congress to get change. But because Congress represents the interests of an oligarchy and of the wealthy, there's going to be no change other than very little liberal change to have a safety net for poor people. But other than that, there will be no change, no structural change for racism or white supremacy or whatever, until you have massive protests equal to the pandemic to stop the society. And then when you have that much power in the streets, you bring a set of laws to Congress and say, you need to pass these. We need to effect change. So the short answer to your question is that massive and sustained protest means that, and it means much more massive than the Black Lives Matter protests, and it has to be at least equal to the power of the pandemic.
Thanks, Frank. I see some people have their hands raised. So, Reverend Fahed, I see your hands raised.
Frank, thank you for your presentation. And I think, nonviolence is I feel, the only solution for the Palestinian people. The fellow by the name of Mubarak Awad, some of us know him, and his brother Alex Awad and others. He started to teach in Palestinian village, the Gandhi and Martin Luther. I mean, Martin Luther King method, and he became step by step, very slowly successful. Now, he is a Palestinian American that lost his dad in 48 and came to the US and studied and went to teach. With an American passport, the state of Israel deported him because the teaching of nonviolence was a threat to the state of Israel. Now, my question to you, anytime we talk about nonviolence, some way, somehow, we already created two boxes, that the oppressed are violent and the oppressor are not violent. So we need to put more emphasis these days on the violence of the state. Even from October 7, we just say we condemn what they did in the kibbutz. I agree with it. But the thing that I'm not able to understand, from October 7 until now, all the evangelicals and others are not able to condemn the violence of Israel with everything they did in Gaza. So I think we need to start sharpening our mind that the state is violent more than the oppressed. Thanks.
No, I agree, Reverend Fahed. I agree. And just to respond to that quickly, so here in the U.S., there's now a campaign within the groups that have been advocating, for Palestinian rights for decades and decades to come out against Christian Zionism, because the current administration is filled with Christian Zionists, and and they now have passed laws, issued executive orders to make any sort of attack on Christian Zionism as an attack on their version of Christianity, and to come out against groups advocating for the rights of Palestinians. So I think that's absolutely right. So here we have a campaign that addresses the violence of the state in the context of this Christian nationalism, this Christian Zionism, and that's something that all of us could take part in our communities or in our groups. Whether you're in the U.S. or in another country, because in my view, people who consider themselves Christian and advocate for war and advocate for the occupation of Palestine have not read the Gospels, and they're interpreting things in their own way, which is actually against what Jesus taught. So yes, so there's a campaign here against Christian Zionism, and I would say that we all should take it up in whatever group and wherever we work, for whomever we work, and we can learn more about it. We can learn more about it by just going on the internet and looking up the groups that have put together campaigns against Christian Zionism.
Thanks, Frank. Lyndon, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to thank Yutan and also Sabeel for these events, and particularly for the topic today, and Frank for your presentation, and for the recapitulation of a little bit of the history. And I wanted to add to that narrative about South Korea, which I think has been really a timely model for us in the United States, a reminder that it is possible to confront abuses of power when the people do rise up. And I've been a social justice activist since the 60s. I was there when in those actions in Washington, D.C. in 1971 and before 1969 to shut down the city because of the war. And now there just seems like there's a big convergence on what's necessary for us in the United States to do because of the abuses of power that are going on right before our eyes, and that are driving, as you mentioned, driving what our government is doing in Palestine and other places in the world. So it really seems to me like we do need to take direct action, and that most of the advances, most of the good laws that we have in this country are a result, as you demonstrated, in your talk, of direct action in the streets. And I was really particularly inspired by Mother Jones and some of the walking. And I'm actually in Boston. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I've been struggling about what action can we take. It really feels like we need, because the government, the legislators are not, they've been captured also. So we can't rely on our so-called elected representatives. They're not doing anything. And we really need, in the best tradition of the country, Boston is the cradle of the American Revolution, right? With the Boston Tea Party. And so I'm just starting to imagine a walk to DC and gathering people along the way to be prepared to actually block the Doge demons, I'm calling them, Although I think I need to be careful about demonizing or dehumanizing the people that are abusing their access to power. So I am trying to be mindful here too, but I hope that we can think about some concrete actions to take because we don't have a lot of time. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
I'll just respond quickly. Thank you, Lyndon, for that. I think if you have a vision of a walk, that you should do the walk and you should organize it. And, look, I think that when we act, God also acts. So if you take it to organize something like that, and it doesn't have to be big because it'll grow with every mile you walk, it'll grow and you'll have people. You should do it and organize it with groups that can support you. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I see
Mary Ann, you have a
Brady
question?
Flores has her hand up.
Can I just say, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and if people have an interest in that kind of vision, I would really be grateful to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndon. And Mary Ann, if you have a question, you can unmute. I think you're muted. Give me a second. Mary Ann? Can you hear us?
Okay, there we go. I was struggling with trying to get the screen to allow me to unmute. So Frank, it is great to hear your voice and see you on the screen. I'm in the middle of driving and I've got a big truck behind me. I had three thoughts. One I put in the chat about the use of the word civil resistance versus civil disobedience, which has to do with under the laws and the treaties that we've signed on to, that we wish to uphold the international law and the human rights laws. When we go to act, we can think about pursuing our legal strategy as being civilly resistant versus civilly disobedient, which is about breaking law. So that's a thought. The other thing is, I feel like we can, I don't know whether we need to think of our strategies as needing to be as big as the pandemic, because we didn't have the pandemic going on back in the Vietnam days. We didn't have that happening during the women's suffragette or the days of the abolition. But there were massive efforts. There were people in the streets. There were people surrounding the White House and so on. I was encouraged, and I said this last week on Thursday on the Sabile call, very encouraged by looking at the pictures of the cities of Chicago and LA, where they were shutting down the streets because of the immigrants' rights crises, with the ICE raids. That people do know how to shut it down, like they did in Puerto Rico too, when they had to get rid of the governor Rosselló. 3 million out of 4 got into the streets and just mucked up the works. The other thought I had, let me think for 1 sec. Well, it was good to see that you used the examples of the Plowshares actions and then the actions up in New London at Electric Boat. There will be more actions coming up. I know in March, Bill Offenloch is on the line and he could probably be more accurate about the dates. But also there's a lot of actions at the anti-killer drone actions coming up. Let's see, we've got them in, Bill, help me out with the names of the bases. There's a national call to action on February 23rd, World Beyond War. If you go to their website, worldbeyondwar.org, David Swanson has been coordinating efforts that are global. And I know we in upstate New York are planning to go, we're planning first to do a church service, at a Catholic church service, and maybe it'll be interfaith. But then we will go out to Hancock Air Base, which is on the other side of the what is it? The airport. So it's when you look out the terminal as you're sitting in the, waiting for your flight, you can see buildings across the park, across the tarmac, and that's where the assassinations are happening, from these computer rooms where the people are sitting and killing people. Anyway, so those were my 3 thoughts. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. No,
Good.
thank you, Marianne. Yeah. Again, I can't really stress enough the issue of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war, and the idea that we need to be intersectional in our struggles and to raise all of these issues because they're all existential threats.
Sorry, before I get to Ted, I saw a question in the chat. I feel there might need to be some time to answer this question. I think it's important. Carol asked, do you know if a negative view of protesters has always been there in the United States, in terms of protest movements? And maybe more importantly, can mass protests succeed without massive popular support? So just based on your knowledge of nonviolent resistance, I wonder if you have answers to these questions.
I think there's always a negative view of protesters. I don't, but it's always going to come from the people in power, from the elite who want to maintain their control and their domination. And since the elite and the government have control of the media, of the mainstream media, the protesters are always demonized. You can just look at the poor students who are demonstrating against the genocide in Gaza and how they were treated in the media, where you had not just college presidents but also like Congress people, demonizing them. So there is always that view of protesters, but I don't think it's the dominant view in the sense of how many of support. I think more people support protesters than don't. It's just that the narrative and the narrative in the media is captured by the oligarchs, by the elite. And then with respect to the massiveness of a protest, no, I mean, I do think that you need some sort of you need massiveness and sustained massiveness um, to to affect change, whether or not it's as massive as a pandemic, like Marianne said. I'm using a metaphor, right? So no, people know how to shut it down, and you don't need 100% of the population to do it, right? But at the same time, it can start as a little ripple. It can start as like you throw a small pebble into the water and it ripples. And you can have one small action that can lead and amplify and lead to many, many actions, And to give an example, the draft board raids. So, the Catonsville Nine, they went into a draft board, they took out the draft files and they burned them. And after that action, there were numerous other actions against draft boards that helped to amplify the resistance to the draft of the Vietnam War. Same with Black Lives Matter. I mean, they started as small demonstrations that spontaneously grew. So you don't need to start with massive, but I think there's some element of massiveness to affecting change. Yeah.
Thanks, Frank, for your answer to this. Ted, I saw you had your hand raised. You have a question?
Yeah, I had a few questions and comments. One thing is that if you look at it honestly, across the many years and beyond years, there are only a few things that have actually worked. And I'm not wanting to be disparaging about that. I'm just saying that's good and it's bad. The goodness of it is those that did work, whether it's India or South Africa or whatever, where it really made a change, or the COVID situation. I'm sure there is a study done, or many studies done, as to the commonality of what worked. In other words, what is it? What is the strategy? What is the tactic? What is the one that really turned the tide? And I think you'll find, surprisingly, that across all of these injustices, there are keys that are common, and therefore they deserve study and use over and over again. Um, and just one last thing, and that should be obvious. The reason COVID worked is COVID spared no one. So it's not like, oh, well, the rich can just, don't worry about it. The rich were being struck like the poor. So we need to look hard to make sure to show where the rich are hurt and use that as part of our strategy. Thank you.
I think Diane, you had your hand raised.
Ted, I get what you're saying, but I'm wondering if it has to be not either, it has to be all of the above, that every action produces another action, which may not be identical, but it will be connected and produce another source of action. And as I think Frank said, the pebble in the water. So, and the other idea of long time struggle, sustained struggle. When I wanted something as a kid, my mother would always say to me, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. Maybe some of you who are my age heard that too. So it's a long struggle. And it's in the struggle, I think, where we learn and where good can be done as well.
Mhm.
Thanks, Diane. Mary Ann, do you have something to say? Oh, you're muted again.
Okay, sorry, I thought I had undone it. I so appreciate the breadth of the history that you gave us, Frank. From way back until now, going forward. I just was remembering something that I saw on social media this morning. What's happening in Gaza, that there are US contractors that are driving in to do the security in the northern part of Gaza. I don't know whether anybody else has heard about this, but I saw the trucks, I saw the contractors on the screen. So it's just a note. I don't have any solutions for it, but just to be aware that it sounds like what Trump has, oh, okay, heard this from Bison's video. Yeah, that Trump may be going forward with this horrific plan. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Ann. Reverend Fahad, and then let's try to wrap in terms of what Frank is saying. He can have some last statements. So Reverend Fahad.
I just heard an Israeli American professor saying the greatest fear of the Israelis, government and people, that the Palestinian will say, I do not want a state. I want to be an equal citizen. And to me, maybe this is the best nonviolent way. I know Israel want to be a Jew. I know America want to support a Jewish state. So I think we need to have the Palestinians saying we want to be equal citizens. That's the only, I think that's the most powerful way of nonviolent, uh, uh, to deal with our situation.
Yes, I agree. I never thought the two-state solution was really reconciliatory, and that people living together and sharing is really the the better option. But of course, Rome wasn't built in a day, and to get that kind of um, compassion and sympathy, for people to live together, I don't know how long it will take. And in the meantime, there are forces that are trying to exterminate the Palestinians. But I agree with you, Reverend Fahed, that the better solution, the nonviolent solution, is to live together in one place. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. We can have a larger discussion after. I think there's one question. I don't know if you know the answer to this. I have my own thoughts about it, but Mike asked, what was it, and if you know about the history of the Great March of Return in Gaza, what was it about the Great March of Return that meant that nonviolent action didn't have effect? So I'm curious if you have answers to this, or if you have any thoughts on this.
Nonviolence doesn't always work in the short run, and maybe even in what we consider the long run. Because to me anyway, the effort of nonviolent resistance or of civil obedience to the just laws is based on an ethic of doing what's right in terms of our vision of compassion and transcendence, right? Whether it's a Christian or some other, right, philosophy or religion. And so it's not done for effectiveness, even though, like someone said, nonviolence has been more effective than violence in sort of bringing about change. But it may not always work. And the thing today is that the implements of state violence are so lethal and so acute and so existentially a threat when you think about nuclear war and nuclear weapons, that there may not be a long run for nonviolence to work with respect to, let's say, Gaza. Or Palestine. I don't know, but what I do know is that to get something that could be more permanent and more lasting and more reconciliatory, it would have to be nonviolent. I mean, you not using violence. Well, let me put it this way. So let's say all of the Palestinians in Gaza refuse to be exiled. They just stay put and start building from the rubble, right? So what Israel could shoot them all, right? There were proposals to nuke the place, right? I don't know. But either way, whatever happens, they will have taken a stand. And whether they don't shoot or whether they shoot, right, they'll end up in the same place if that's the design that the US and Israel has. And so in that context, you're better off not shooting, if you're thinking about it. And if you think about it from doing what's right, you wouldn't want to shoot anyway, and maybe not shooting and staying there and building from the rubble will get the kind of international response and cooperation that's needed to stop the US and Israel's plans. I guess another way I guess what I'm saying is that if you really want to stop what's happening in Gaza from happening, everybody needs to gang up on the US and Israel. And this includes all of these nonviolent methods that I've talked about, and I've gone through, including the Arab states that border Israel. That, to me, that's the key. If they are bought off, then it's going to be, I don't know, it doesn't look good. So that's my own. Well, what do you think? You said you had your own thoughts.
No, I think I had similar thoughts in terms of you. And I wanted to have a broader discussion also about Sabil's work, and I think you mentioned Christian Zionism, which I think is really important, especially in the Western context. So I wonder, maybe you have some final thoughts first before we enter into a larger discussion about, final thoughts about nonviolent action, what you think the next step for people who want to start these small pebbles of change in their communities. What does that look like for you?
I think it's like I said before, I think if people have a vision, they should act on it and act on it with groups. I think that groups like Sabeel are doing the right thing, and you should continue organizing, for nonviolent direct action. And my hope is that all of these different struggles will merge together to form like one great big, general strike or whatever to stop this administration and to support the Palestinians. Um, there are many groups, and they're all working at the same idea, but in different ways. So you can join all these groups that are doing nonviolent actions. Um, and the issue is to channel it all to be more, to make it larger. I mean, those are my thoughts. And the other thing is that for those of us who are older and have lived through this for decades, I think it's important to teach the young people about our experiences, to mentor, because we've all had experiences and we can all add to what we've gone through to this. So that's important as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Oh.
Frank, for being with
Yeah.
us and presenting this important topic. I wanted to open up to the discussion. We have some actions actually this week that are actually related to what you said about Christian Zionism. So I can link that if people are curious. The campaign focuses more on emailing and calling senators, but I think in line with the topic of international support and in line with Sabeel's work, Sabeel has for decades produced alternative theologies of liberation that I think is important, that if you're going to combat Christian Zionism through these campaigns, through these actions, you also need to provide alternatives and new theologies for people to be drawn into. And so I think that's also important maybe as a discussion. Sabeel, we've been in the process of talking about how can we bring back energy to the action part of our Palestinian liberation theology internationally. And so I would love a discussion. Maybe we can open up a discussion on, based on where you are in your own contexts and in your own communities, how do you think Sabeel, for example, can provide the resources? Like what type of resources might you need from Sabeel or support from Sabeel to affect change in your communities or churches? And that might be a good conversation as Sabeel thinks and rethinks how we can do these types of nonviolent resistance and strengthen the movement. One of the, I think, challenges is that, and we talk a lot about this at Sabeel, is that the oppressor is in many more ways more united than the people who are resisting the nonviolent, like international movement. And that's something that maybe we can talk about as well. So anyways, I'll link the campaign to the, it's specific to the Mike Huckabee campaign where Trump recommended his confirmation as the ambassador to Israel. And so Fosnell launched a campaign to try to block this. So I'll link this here so you can read more information about this and call or email your senators. John, you had your hand raised. I think you're muted.
Yes. Yes, I wanted to ask to be able to use in various groups work of Sabeel's and Kumi now. Is it possible that they have archived the programs that we could use in groups? And how would we access that?
Yes,
like this one today.
Yeah, so Kumi now, we have an archive on our website and on our YouTube channel. So I can just link that again. And we have basically every single video we've made in the past few years regarding Kumi now. It's there. And so there's some videos that cover some topics that might be really good to share with communities, and you can use that to share with people. So I'll link that in the chat right now. And then in terms of theological resources, Sabeel has it's probably hard to find on the website, so I can send a link to it. But we used to produce quarterly Cornerstone publications, and this covers a specific topic on Palestine on a theological level, and it covers scholars and theologians, and they produce articles related to Palestine. So whether this be the different theological movements in Palestine or reflections on Christmas amidst massacres, we have all these volumes and topics that are, I think, really important, and they're short, so it's easy for people to read and kind of understand instead of reading, say, like an entire book, on Palestinian liberation theology. So I can link this. Maybe this would be helpful for people. And we're going to be in a process of trying to categorize these topics more for people to access easier. So hopefully that would also help in the future. Yeah, thanks, John, for bringing that up. Lyndon, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have some thoughts about how Sabeel could support us and the movement. And it really piggybacks on what you were saying, Tan, about the publications. But I think decolonizing, having an event about decolonizing Palestinian liberation theology. There's been a Palestinian theologian, Mitri Raheb, has a recent book called Decolonizing Palestine, the People, the Land, the Bible, that I finally just finished reading. It's a very short book, but very powerful. And I found a continuation of what he's talking about in the book by an American indigenous lawyer, Stephen Newcomb, called Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. So I think the indigenous connections between Palestinian people and the indigenous people of Turtle Island and other areas is very much alive. It was my political work with indigenous people around trying to stop construction of the Line 3 pipeline in northern Minnesota that actually really brought the Palestinian situation to the foreground of my consciousness in a way that had never been present before, because it does, as probably all of you know, perhaps better than me, what's going on in Palestine mirrors what has been going on in the United States for at least 400 years. So I think supporting the intrinsic or organic connections of the indigenous communities, and then putting us white, the ones of us who are white, beginning to get used to the idea of being in supporting roles, as allies and accomplices, and not leading, not taking up so much space. So those are some thoughts. And you're doing a really good job, I think, in trying to build in action components for all of the theoretical and prayerful work that we're doing. I have always loved what Abraham Joshua Heschel said when he was challenged about marching with Martin Luther King on the Jewish Sabbath, that he was praying with his feet. And I think that's what I want to do more and more with my life. And I'm grateful to you all and to Sabeel for helping me along with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. Are there any other comments or thoughts? I wanted to link also the Kumi Now Action website again. There's a few, so the two actions that were updated on this, the first is what I mentioned, the Hakobi campaign. The second one is actually something that just happened in the last 2 days. Maybe some of you have been aware of this, and this is related to what's happening in East Jerusalem right now. I think yesterday or two days ago, during late hours, the Israeli police and military stormed the educational bookshop in East Jerusalem. and arrested two of the owners who are brothers. And they've been in East Jerusalem for decades. And they're kind of the cornerstone of the Palestinian community in East Jerusalem, but they also educate internationals and Israelis on Palestine. So they have books, cultural books, cookbooks, poetry, all sorts of things. And they were arrested, and the military ransacked the bookshops, took any books that had the Palestinian flag on it, and basically accused them of public incitement. And Sabeel, we're very close with them in terms of partnership. They often are present in our delegations. They were released, fortunately, this morning. But we have a campaign to try to support their work. So I did link in the action page a link to their website. So if you would like to support by donating, I think they have maybe a gift card option, because I think if you try to ship some of these books, it might be expensive in terms of worldwide shipping. But if you want to support them in some way through that link, or share also their story, that would be really important. So it's called the Educational Bookshop. And yeah, so I have that linked in the action page.